So now in this part, what we're going to do is we're going to take the rock and we're going to send it over to max, but it's the very, very low res. It's level 0 without any of the detail. And we're going to create displacement maps. We're going to displace the rock back up into its shape again in max at render time and not in the viewport. So we've got our rock, and let's go back to our extract rock operation. We're going to turn off the ambient occlusion and turn on the displacement map option. Same settings as before for the most part, anti-aliasing 2 and whatnot, and we're going to create a new file. This one's going to be called rock_disp for rock displacement, and we're going to run that. Just a second, this one's very quick to calculate. And now we have this bump map that's been added in. So when we flick the bump map on and off, you can see a change happening here. This is step right down to the bottom, and you can see a change happening. It's just displaying it as a bump map, so you can see that it's actually generated something. Let's take a look at that again. Just say solo as diffuse. So what you can see then is all the high points and all the sort of the shapes and forms. And this is the a straight up black and white. Works just like a bump map, except it's going to actually generate geometry and push the surfaces out in max as we need them. I'll just unsolo that so we've got it back, and I'm just going to turn off the model, and now let's send it over to max, and we can send it over at max. Doesn't matter what state we're at, because when we say send to max as new scene, nothing is selected. Let's select the model, and then let's say send to max as new scene. We can say send base mesh or mesh at current level. I'm going to say base mesh and send that over, and max is going to load up a base mesh model. So here's our model. It even came in textured for us. It's going to load up a slate and go to the eyedrop picker and pick the texture so that we can see it in the in slate here. So here we have, it always brings in a reflection map as well, which we really aren't going to need in this case because we're probably going to do something else in max with that. So we can just disable that for now. We've even got a self-illumination map, and that's come in from the map that's the incandescence file that we stored. So it's actually collapsed all of the files for us, which is really nice, and put them into the individual layers. So it came over with us with a full texture going. What we need to do is we need to add in the displace now and get that displace going. So I'm just going to say bitmap, and we're going to go in and find our files. So let's go down and grab our files. Never opens in the right place, of course. So we're just going to go pick it out. Master classes, CreatingRocks, and we've got all these displace rock files. I've been trying different ones, and we want the most recent one, which looks like it's going to be 245, 253. Yeah, let's just say date. How about that one? And it'll be that file there. So we'll hook that one in for the displacement settings. Now we also need to make sure that our render engine is set up to mental ray at this point. Default scan line won't handle that. So NVIDIA mental ray, and we can set that on. Something else I should note, while we're in here, if we go into the renderer and we scroll on down, we can actually find a section on displacement with settings. Now this is a global setting overall. We tend to want to set that as a local setting. So I'm going to right click on the object and pick object properties, go into the mental ray tab, and here's the displacement again with use global settings, turn that off, and then we can set our settings as we need them. So with edge length, that's the maximum length of the edges in pixels. So as the model is further away from it, it's going to generate less geometry than when it's really close to us. And I'm just going to pull that down, probably down to about a 1 that I've tested. Looks like it works pretty good. Max displacement is the max amount that it's going to push it out. So I'm just going to crank that up right now so it doesn't clip it off, because it'll actually flatten off the tops for us. And I'm going to say OK on that. And let's just show our render window. I think I'll do this side. Might look a little more interesting. And perspective. And everything's put in there, specular levels, and so let's hit render on that and see what we get. So computing final gather, and you can see it's actually pushed the rock out, trying to create the surface. Now the UVs get really messed up when you come over to Max and you don't have a proper unwrap. So the method we used for the unwrapping really isn't very good at all. And you can see the UVs are sort of all over the place. The other problem is that it's looking very bulbous right now. It's looking for sort of very lumpy and everything, and that's not good. So let's find out why that is. And if we go back to Mudbox, I'm going to take this. I think it's sitting at 640,000. I'm going to step it down one, and that is going to be 160,000. Maybe at 40,000. I'll send it over at that level. That's not that big a difference in its shape. This is a fair bit of detail still in this one. Let's just send this over to Max as well. I'm going to say add selected to current scene, and I want to say send mesh at current level this time, so that I can explain what's happening here. So when you look at the two, essentially there's areas that need to be pushed in. So this is the low res model that's down below here, and this is the high res model. So some of the areas need to get pulled out. Other areas actually need to be pushed down into the mesh and whatnot. Let's just give those different colors and go wireframe. And you can see that the white one is the low res model, and you can see where it's being pulled out. Problem is that the displacement settings in the material are actually only pushing out. So black is the base and white is pushed out, so it's only pushing out from the surface. So we're probably getting a sort of more bulbous sort of look to it, because as it pushes it out from the surface, that's exactly what's happening. It's pushing out too much. The low points become pushed up as well, because they're not pushing back into the surface. What we're going to do is just roll down and find an output. There it is, the output, and drop it on the input of the displacement map. And I'll go into it and open up the output settings. Now in here we could even play around with a few things. We could enable color map, we could color correct it and push and pull its values a bit, maybe add some contrast if we need to. But more importantly, what there is there's RGB offset. And if we look at the output of this map in the final result here, if we push RGB offset backwards down into negative values, say 0.5, what we've just done is it goes all black on us, but if you think about it in terms of values, essentially mid-tone gray is the base level now, and it's been pushed backwards down into the negatives. So this will actually give us a rock that is the other way around. It'll probably be too pushed in and too much. I'm thinking we're going to need not that much. It looked like there was a lot more coming out than there was going in as far as distance goes. So I'll let this render out. You'll see the render comes out smaller now, more accurate. Looks more like what we want. You'll still probably see the odd seam and whatnot, but it's probably been pushed in. Things are looking a little sort of measly now and crammed into it. Let's try a negative 0.1, for instance, and see what that does and see how that reacts to it. And we just need to find the sweet point now where we get the same shape back out of this instead of this high res. And let's just make sure we have. Oh, we didn't delete that one. Well, no wonder we're seeing the right thing. Let's try that. That's why it looks so good. So it'll look too pushed in at this point. So this one should look probably a little bit better. Again, the texture will look better, but still it's going to look stretched, and I'm still seeing it looking pretty bulbous at this point. So let's try it back down at the smaller levels. Let's try negative 0.5 again and go back and do that test again, just to ensure that it's not being pushed out too much. So render times would be quicker probably if we just threw all the polygons at it, but that can become really huge amounts of overhead. So again, here you can see it all crushed in. So this is the what's happening to it when it's being pushed in too much. So we should try it maybe at a 0.2, negative 0.2, and play around this again just until we get it to the sweet spot, until it starts looking right. So that's looking a lot better. One thing I do find in Max is that it does like to have, when I'm doing this, it does like to have one layer of NURMS subdivision on it. And it tends to clean up the mapping issues a little bit when they come in. Even doing that, it's not going to generate more geometry at render time, because that rendering is based on the amount of pixels and how close we're getting to it. So that's looking much cleaner now. As soon as I added that NURB subdivision, you can see it comes out looking clean. And so if we looked around this and sort of inspected it, maybe I'll do an angle here where we can see this outcropping coming up. So let's do that render. And so you can see this outcropping popping up and out at this point. I'm still thinking that's looking a little bulbous. If we compare the two, it's a little harder edged than our final render here. So I'd say we need to go a little bit lower still, or higher, I guess. Let's go back to a 0.1 and see what we get. And that's looking pretty good. A little bit still too round in areas. Maybe a little bit harsher, but getting pretty close. Let's try actually pushing our edge lengths down a bit more. Make sure our max distance is up. And we'll do the render again. Now, of course, the lower that max length, the edge length goes, the higher the render times are going to be, because it's generating more and more edges and edge loops and polygons, or faces, I guess, because it's triangulating the model. But it is only creating those where it needs to, around those hard edges, around those tight corners and whatnot. If you got a big flat area, that's actually going to get less polygons, and it won't matter as much in that spot. It doesn't look like there's a huge difference in what I'm getting. Not quite as sharp in areas. Now, one of the things can be is also putting out too low a res map. I did anti-alias it, so let's try one that's not anti-aliased and see how that works. So I'm just going to overwrite that same map and same displacement without anti-aliasing on, and see if it produces just a sharper result from it. Okay, so there we go. Now let's go back to max and displace 2. There it is. That's it for sure. And let's also use that output node in there and connect it up. So we're going to connect into that. Connect it in. And we'll see with the anti-aliasing off, it gives us a tighter, cleaner model. We can also push the contrast a little bit and try and sharpen it up that way as well. Not seeing a huge difference. I'm looking at this corner here and this line down here to see if we can get it a little bit sharper. So now let's also, I'm just going to, again, down into object properties, turn that back up to get a bit faster feedback and see if we can get this in here. So let's go in here and let's go to enable color map mono, and then we can actually adjust the right click and say Bezier, and let's actually clamp that off a bit more and see what that does. See if that pushes our contrast, and see if it, I mean, it could have gone way too far at this point. No, nothing overall. It's still a little round, but it looks pretty darn good, and we don't have any geometry in the viewport to deal with. So that's the big advantage of those. Now the next step, of course, is using vector displacement maps. And a vector displacement map is actually in 3 dimensions. It doesn't just push the surface out; it can actually pull the surface around bends and corners, and that can certainly help an enormous amount in the way the surface is derived. And you can get very, very accurate representations of the high-res mesh by recalculating those values. The drawback with those is they have to be generated on the mesh that you're going to be using for rendering, as we're doing. You can't make a retopo mesh and project on and have those values work. It won't create them. It looks to me like I'll put a level 2 turbo smooth on there to try it, and it certainly looks really harsh now. Let's try it back at this angle and see what we get. I'm just using the NURM subdivision that's built into the edit poly here, just to up-res it before it goes to render, to see if it makes any difference. It doesn't look like it is, but I find one level of NURMs seems to clean up the mapping, and I'm still seeing round. It's just pushed in more. The whole thing's just sort of like crushed in a little bit more or something. So I'm just going to take that back down to 1 because it was a bit faster that way, and we can play with the output value and take a look at these. I'm just going to turn off the color map. I don't think it's helping us a lot. And I think that's pretty much our final at this point. It looks pretty good. Now what we can do is really crisp up the values and corners and everything with using a normal map. So let's take a look at putting a normal map on it now and generate one of those. So this is looking pretty good. Normal map might get us better values overall, and see if we can clean that up. So let's go back to our rock now. I'm just going to get rid of the bottom one here, delete selected, and just turn it off. And so here's our high-res model again, and extract again, displacement off. There's the vector displacement we could try, and there's the normal map, and I'm going to say just anti-aliasing of 2 again, and let's make sure we're in the right spot. So rock norm, and it's a subdivision level again, and we're going to make this for max. We could invert it in max, or we can invert it in here. It's either way. So I'm going to drop this on, and somehow I don't believe that actually worked that fast, but it seems to have done. There's the normal map, and you can see it's just really made a huge change to the model because we've got all the sculpting on here. But as soon as we step it down, what the normal map is doing is trying to bring that detail back and trying to pull it in. So let's see if we can get this to blend in to the bump map channel as well, and get that to work. So let's go back to max, and now in our map, I'll just delete that. I'll get rid of the reflection. I'm going to go into the bump map channel, and we're going to go and put in a normal bump. And then in the normal map, we're going to put in a bitmap, and that's going to be our rock norm. It's going to go in there, and we have it set to 1. Our bump, let's make sure this is set, bump to 100. And we could even pump this in as a bump map as well if we wanted for an additional bump map. Let's see how that looks and see what it does for us. It's not going to make a difference on the outsides, but we might get what looks like harder edges and whatnot. It looks like it's overdoing it. Now here's the trick, is to not overdo it and pull those values back. It looks like it's really pushing it too much. Rotate it around and just do another render from the we call it the front side of it. So that's with right now normal map, bump map, and displacement map all full bore, all completely turned up, and it looks pretty good. It's not bad. It certainly needs a little bit. I can see some sort of issues in the way it's being done. So we could try playing it up and down. Let's also go and do. I seem to have lost my. There we go. Bring that back in there. Let's disconnect the bump map and see what happens. See if it makes any change. I think it's just the normal map doing it. But what we can do then is, instead of creating a displacement of our very highest level with all of that fine detail in there, we could create a displacement actually down a step or two, turn off our top layers where we painted that detail, and then just use the normal map to generate the final fine detail in it. It looks a little bit better actually without the bump map being piped in. So that's a little bit cleaner there. So there's our rock being generated now, just from a lump in the viewport, and you can see that we're getting quite a nice rock going there, and it looks very close, but we don't have to worry about the rock being in the viewports and having to be tessellated way up at render time, because a turbo smooth modifier or something would tessellate it evenly. Now we can use a displace approximate and try that out. It still doesn't work anywhere near as well as it does when it starts doing it in RenderMan or another one of the rendering engines, or Mental Ray that we're using, and V-Ray and all those, that it handles it at render time and calculates it up at render time. It does a far better job. Now on characters, this is going to work really well too for high detail, because we can make sure that the base model is riggable and has nice edge loops and follows those sorts of criteria. And then again at render time, it gets pushed back out into its full detail. And again, especially with a vector map, if you can get that to work. But again, to produce the vector map, you have to have been doing your sculpting on the final mesh, which is still possible. I mean, there's ways of doing that, and if you're very careful, to be able to get those vector map lines. So there's their tutorial for creating a rock and doing displacement maps and texturing in Mudbox. Hope you enjoyed it.